2. Whoo!
Welcome to Authenticity Lab, a podcast where we celebrate the journey of reconnecting with our authentic selves. I'm Dr. Kelsey Miles. I'm a musician, songwriter, and also a chemistry professor. I'm so excited that you're here. Each week, I'll share a new story and I'll break it down using none other than the scientific method. And I will invite you to take a life experiment that will help you live more boldly, lead with curiosity, and embrace what really makes you who you are. Let's dive into today's episode. If you are new here, this is the perfect episode to start with. And if you've been listening for a while, we're going to take everything we've talked about and go deeper. This is the first episode of a mini-series where I'll break down how to experiment in life, step by step, using the scientific method. Now, before I get into the mechanics of this, I have something to share that is much bigger. And it's why experimenting in life is actually the key to you finding your purpose. Even if you don't know what you're looking for. Look, I understand that idea of wishing that you could just have clarity right now. I'm an extremely impatient person. I want to know. And I often get stuck in my head where I am thinking of what it is that I should be or should do. The way that you feel really purposeful in your life is through experiments. Actually saying the thing that you thought, actually taking the step. That's what I've learned. Finding your purpose is not a thinking thing. It is a series of small experiments. And that's why in this episode, I thought it was so important for me to dive deeper into why we need to run the experiments. And in the story I'm going to share with you today, I'm also going to show you how you often experiment in life without even knowing you're doing it. When you run those experiments, you gain data, and that's what gives you momentum. All the time we get stuck in our heads, that's just it. We're stuck. My goal with this podcast is to invite you to take the next step. I have been stuck so many times in my life. I have absolutely, in my opinion, wasted time that I didn't need to if I had just taken the next step and just run the experiment and just see what happens. And I'm going to show you exactly what I mean about this with this story. So, back in high school, I was in choir and I entered the solo and ensemble competition. And if you're familiar with choir in high school, I think it's just in high school. I'm not sure. But you can enter as a solo or an ensemble, and you can also do instrumentation as solo and ensemble. And I entered doing a solo piece, and I sang my heart out. I did the best I could. I think I had a mezzo-soprano piece. I did not score the highest. The highest is a 1. I scored a 2. Now, that doesn't seem like anything that would be classified as a failure, but my high school had a very, very, very good choir program, and our choir director was very hard on us and really pushed us to do well. I remember all of my other classmates getting 1s, and I think I may have been the only person, if I remember right, the only person that got a 2 on their solos. I'm not sure about the ensembles. So the competition was on a weekend, and when we went back to school, I was mortified. I was sitting in choir class, and our teacher called me back to her office. And I just felt like, the whole rush of just like, oh my gosh, she's so mad at me that I got a 2. And she was concerned that I got a 2. I was pretty much right. And we go back there and she's asking me, well, what happened and all this stuff. And she was a pretty strict teacher, but she sure did push us to be our best. And I remember leaving that conversation with her right away feeling like I am a terrible singer. That is exactly what came from that conversation and from that experience. I really walked away feeling like I was a terrible singer. And fast forward into graduate school. So I have this thought, it's in my head, it's pretty deep, it's been there for years. And of course I sing in the, car sometimes or whatever, but I really didn't think I was a great singer. And I finished my undergrad degree, and that took 4 years. And then I went to graduate school at Ohio State. And at the time that I was trying to pull away from my abusive relationship, without knowing it, I naturally started to bring music back into my life. I wasn't consciously thinking I wanted to try music again because I'm going to use it to heal, or I'm going to battle this idea of mine that I'm a bad singer. Like, none of that was conscious. All I know is that I wasn't doing well. I didn't have any confidence. I had no self-worth. And I decided that when I got Alicia Keys' new album, Girl on Fire, I was going to play it in the lab when no one else was there, and I was going to sing to it. It just made me feel good. I started to do this, and then when I moved to Wisconsin, you heard this in the story of episode 2, where I talk about going to karaoke and a colleague of mine hearing me. He overheard me singing, and he said, "You're a good singer. Don't stop." And I really remember being so surprised by hearing someone say that, because the conclusion I had drawn from that high school event was that I was a terrible singer, and I just kept that with me. So without knowing it, that small experiment of me singing in the lab led to the next, which is me singing in the lab and someone heard me, which led me to the next, which I was like, I'm going to stop at a karaoke bar. Not because I'm proving myself that I could sing, but I just knew that it felt joyful. It gave me ease. It made me feel more free. In a way, each one of those small experiments, the results I was getting was leading me to something that felt good for me. And eventually, I went on to start writing my own music. And I started playing shows out. I was getting paid. I became a full-time musician traveling around the US. And this is so crazy to me, this story of me thinking I was a terrible singer to now. Like, just recently, I came back from Memphis. I was representing Kansas City, representing a city in an international challenge. It was the International Blues Challenge. And I advanced to the semifinals with my singing and my original music. You see, I didn't let that one experiment define me. However, when I was running the other little experiments, I wasn't trying to prove it wrong consciously. It just kind of happened. And each one led me to more of my purpose. It's funny, running experiments doesn't have to be done consciously. In fact, I bet you already do it. When I look back, and if I had felt that discomfort, I know that if I had done it more consciously, I wouldn't have held on to that thought that I was a terrible singer for as many years as I did. That's why I'm recording this episode, is because what I learned is that when we can be conscious about those beliefs and thoughts that we want to challenge, we can move through them faster. We don't have to be stuck with any thought process that doesn't serve us. And every time that we take the next small step, we're just finding the next thing that feels good. And on top of that, one experiment that has some conclusion doesn't necessarily mean that is the final conclusion. You see, I didn't have enough data. I did not have enough data. I had one experience in high school where it didn't go so well. Okay, maybe 2. Okay, I remember this vividly. I have to tell you this now. We were singing a piece, and we had just moved to the band room. I think we had like a big full choir in there. And I remember my choir teacher looking at me and telling me to be quiet, like quiet down, like it wasn't right or something. And I felt like I was singing so well. And it took me years later on, a friend of mine who was in choir with me too in high school, we both laughed and she said, "You have a blues soul vocal." And she has this beautiful choir vocal. Sarah, if you're hearing this, this is you. And it really reminded me that probably my blues soul vocal that may have been starting to come out in high school wasn't the best thing for a choir. But in the moment, I felt so small. I felt like I was a terrible singer. Okay, back to the main story. The point of this is that I didn't let that one experiment define me. And at the same time, I didn't have to consciously try and defeat that thought or move through it. You see, life decided to keep handing me this thing that was on my path, that was on purpose for me to sing. I'm convinced, though, if we see belief systems within ourselves that feel uncomfortable and feel heavy, experimenting through it with small steps leads us to the path of our purpose faster without having to carry that really heavy weight, which is, again, why I'm doing this podcast. So let's break down this story using the scientific method. What's interesting about this story about my high school singing, getting a 2, feeling like I'm a failure, I didn't go into it with a question, really a hypothesis. I just knew I wanted to do this thing. And sometimes that's what happens in life. We just decide to do something. However, no matter if you have a question or a hypothesis, you're still going to collect data on every experiment you run. And when I collected the data and analyzed it, I felt like I wasn't very good at singing. And my conclusion was that I was a terrible singer. Now, the conclusion I drew from that experiment turned out to be wrong. Now, was the data wrong? No, the data wasn't wrong. I was not great at choral singing. However, the conclusion I drew was incorrect. That perception I had around the topic was missing other parts of data. These experiments don't always give us the correct conclusion because that's the human aspect. That's the part of the science that requires that human perspective, your own perspective. I was able to prove that conclusion wrong by doing more experiments. And the more small experiments I ran, the more data I collected. And now I can confidently say that I think I'm a great singer. And I'm not that great of a choral singer. The conclusion is a lot more precise because of all the data I've collected. I didn't have a grand vision for all of these little experiments I ran with singing. Really, what happened was every time I did one and I found some joy, it led me to the next one. And another thing I learned from this was that when something is right for you, it's very, very difficult to mess it up. So in a way, I, from my past, can trust that when something's right for me, it will come back and it will invite me to experiment with it again. And most importantly, is every time I took a step and revealed some data, that's what rewrote my conclusion. No amount of thinking could have done that. No amount of someone else telling me I was a good singer could have done that. I had to experiment in tiny increments myself so I could discover it. And that's what this whole podcast is about. Every time you run an experiment and find more ease and joy within yourself, that automatically puts you closer to your purpose. So these experiments have this twofold energy of benefit, which is why they've helped me so much in my life. It's also helped me create what I call an unshakable foundation. So that way, when life really decides to smack me, which I will talk in later episodes about some of the more recent smacks life has done, I really had a foundation that I could lean on, that I could stand on top of and keep going in life without it completely tearing me down. I'd like to invite you on this experiment. I would love if you would take a little bit of time this week and consider something in your life where you changed a belief about yourself. For me, it was that I was a terrible singer. I changed it into, I'm a great singer. I'm not that strong at choral singing. That belief changed when I did tons of experiments without even knowing it. I guarantee you'll find something. Think of a belief that you've had about yourself that has changed. Now, I want you to think about, and you can list it or write it down or think about it in your head. Think of all the steps it took, all the little nuggets of talking to someone, whatever you had to do. For me, it was starting to sing in the lab, and then I started to sing at karaoke. And then, I just started to take all these little steps that gave me data that changed my belief. What was that for you? What were all the little steps that you did that helped you change the belief? I bet you're going to think of a lot of little steps. It often takes lots of tiny little experiments to drop a belief, especially when we're not doing it consciously. We're just kind of guided into something that feels better without us even really trying to do it. So this week, try and find what that belief was that changed and also what experiments you ran. And I would absolutely love to hear from you. If you'd like to share this with me, I would love to start sharing some stories from the people who are listening to this podcast. That would be so fun for me. So if you come up with something, you're like, oh my gosh, I really want to share this with her. Or that'd be cool if she talked about this. I would love to hear it because often the things that we've worked on is something someone else needs to work on too. We're all so connected. And none of us are doing this alone. None of us are. We just feel like we are sometimes, but we aren't. You can reach out to me by email, kelsey@kelseymiles.com, or just go to my website, kelseymiles.com, and go to the Contact Me page, and that will go straight to my email as well. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would love it if you would share it with someone that you know, maybe someone that you could do some experiments in life with. Maybe it's a friend. You just want to push each other to do this. I would love if you would share it with them. And also you can join my community at kelseymiles.com/thelab, THELAB. And I just want to thank you so much for being here. This is the first episode of the mini-series where I really dive deeper into how do we experiment in life and what are the steps we take. In next week's episode, I'll break down the first step of the scientific method, asking a question. And I'll walk you through how to find a question that really resonates with you. In the past episodes, if something didn't resonate with you, it's likely that the question I'm asking may not be something you're working on. So if that happens in a future episode, feel free to swipe past and meet me again next week. Thank you so very much for joining me on today's episode of Authenticity Lab. I'll see you next week where we're going to talk about how to ask a good question. And the work that you're doing is going to help you live more boldly, lead a life of curiosity, and help you keep being your most amazing, authentic self.
Yeah, that house will always call you home.